Often overshadowed by nearby Melbourne, the city of Geelong is the second largest in Victoria. And if you visit today, you would be hard-pressed to notice that it once boasted one of the biggest tram networks in the state. Unlike those to the north in Ballarat and Bendigo, this once extensive system of tracks, poles and wires has been long forgotten. There are very few signs today that trams ever traversed its streets, yet it once boasted a network that carried over 6.5 million passengers every year. So let's take a look at this forgotten public transport system, how it came about and how it fell apart. Geelong was officially gazetted as a town in 1838, having seen its first permanent European settlement 2 years earlier. The city expanded rapidly, but its population growth was quickly outpaced by that of Ballarat and Bendigo during the 1850s gold rush, as people packed up and headed north in search of riches. Nevertheless, Geelong's ongoing development prompted calls by its citizens for some form of public transport. These first lobbying efforts in the 1880s were not very successful. Trams were initially considered by authorities as an option, but due to financial cuts caused by the depression of the 1890s, horse-drawn omnibuses were introduced instead. However, these were pretty uncomfortable, slow, and filled the streets with horse manure, all things that you generally want to avoid in a transport system. Despite these drawbacks, these omnibuses remained all that the city had. Geelong was forced to watch on jealously as Melbourne and other cities around Australia expanded and upgraded their nice big tramway networks, and without the horse boo. After many years of this, the catalyst for bringing trams to Geelong finally arrived: the introduction of public electricity. This happened in 1901, when the Melbourne Electric Supply Company set up shop here. This only reignited the lobbying from earlier years for better public transport, and having seen the successes of trams elsewhere in Australia, this became the focus of the new campaign. This turned out to be a good coincidence, because the Electric Supply Company were also very interested in setting up trams. At the time, it was not unheard of for a utilities company to operate tramways. Other examples include the North Melbourne Electric Tramways and Lighting Company, which operated trams around Essendon until 1922. Back to 1901, and the Melbourne Electric Supply Company spent many years saving the required funds and going through the many processes required from local and state governments to operate. Interestingly, part of the reason that it took so long was because Victorian railways were hesitant to allow trams to cross their railway lines at level crossings. This still happened in several networks, but there are very few left today. Despite these delays, by 1910 the company finally reached an agreement to build and operate a tramway system in Geelong. When the first tram ran on the 14th of March 1912 to great fanfare, there were 4 lines operating. The system had some double track in the central city, but was otherwise made up of mostly single track with passing loops over approximately 6 kilometres. The trams became very popular, and the company soon expanded the system to meet demand. New track was built to continue down Moorabool Street to South Geelong at the Barwon River in November 1913, and its initial fleet of 7 Adelaide-built tramcars expanded to 10 in 1915. But the 1920s was when the network really saw its most significant expansion. In this decade, 2 lines were built to East Geelong in 1922 and 23, the first along Reary Street to Garden Street, and the second along Garden Street and Ormond Road to Boundary Road. Then there were more extensions opened in Chilwell in September 1927, to Belmont in October 1927, to North Geelong in July 1928, and to Eastern Park in September 1930. All this new track, of course, needed a much larger fleet. Because the trams were needed so quickly, this ended up being a mix made up of the original Adelaide-built vehicles, second-hand trams from Melbourne, 2 imported from the United States, and 8 newer ones from Adelaide. This then brings us up to 1930, when the network reached its peak. Here it was operating 27 trams over a network of about 19 kilometres. This year was also significant, because it's when the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, or SEC, took over the Melbourne Electric Supply Company, including Geelong's booming tram network. The SEC also took over the trams in Ballarat and Bendigo, which were quite a bit older than Geelong's. As a result, some of Geelong's trams were actually transferred to Ballarat as part of a wider program to upgrade the network. By this time, unfortunately, it was the beginning of the end for Geelong's trams. The first blow was the Great Depression of the 1930s. This effectively stopped any significant investment by the SEC or state government and had much wider economic ramifications. Then the Second World War came along, which caused similar freezes on government spending as all available resources were spent on the war effort, although it did increase public transport patronage temporarily. By the 1950s, after years of deferred maintenance and lack of investment, like many other networks, Geelong's trams were in a pretty sorry state. The rapid increase in the popularity of private cars and the amount of government subsidy for roads also saw significant falls in both patronage and available funds. Despite a couple of new trams purchased after the Second World War and some track duplication and modification, the state government had reached a crossroads and had to decide whether to revitalise the network or replace it with buses. To inform this decision, there was an inquiry in September 1953 held by the state government's Transport Regulation Board. Funnily enough, this inquiry was at the request of the very city councils who spent decades lobbying for the trams in the first place, Geelong West and Geelong City Councils. Previously strong supporters of trams, they made a full 180-degree turn in their position, submitting a case to the board opposing the operation of trams and supporting their replacement with motor buses instead. They claimed that trams were noisy and slowed down cars. They also said that the system made heavy financial losses and had not kept up with the pace of development. Another stated reason to get rid of them was the claimed cost of rehabilitating the tracks and build new extensions to more than double the network's length by an extra 19 kilometres. This strategy was unfortunately typical of the time, as opponents of trams inflated costs in attempts to get them to close. And like in most cases, these tactics were successful. When the inquiry announced its findings on the 2nd of November 1954, it perhaps unsurprisingly concluded that the public trams should be replaced by privately operated buses. The closure was also blamed by the SEC on ongoing reductions in patronage, which they somewhat bizarrely blamed on Geelong being, quote, a very bicycle-minded city. In other words, people who lived in Geelong specifically preferred to take short trips by bike rather than by tram. After the state government adopted the inquiry's recommendations in 1955, the plans to close it down were drawn up quickly, despite protests in an attempt to save them. It was wound down in 4 stages, with the last being the closure of the Belmont line on the 25th of March 1956. Thousands of people showed up to farewell tram number 4 as it made its way to Belmont and back for the final journey. After this, the SEC transferred some of the trams and maintenance vehicles to Ballarat and Bendigo, while many others were scrapped or sold. Today, almost none of the once extensive infrastructure is left. There are ongoing rumours of tram tracks underneath asphalt on many roads, but I highly doubt it given the time that's passed and all the road reconstruction that's happened since. But even if they are there, they're underground so you can't see them. Really, there are only a couple of small signs that Geelong ever even had trams. The first and most obvious is the old depot and workshop in the city centre on the corner of Brougham Street and Yarra Street. Part of this large brick building has been retained and is now part of the shopping centre development. You can see the arched entrances for trams to enter and exit the building, together with this wonderful sign facing Brougham Street for the Melbourne Electric Supply Company that we talked about before. And other than a couple of streetlight arms from the era, the only other visible sign is at the corner of Packington Street and Fraser Street in Newtown. You'll see here that one side of the street has a much wider turning radius and footpath than the others. This is because it's where the tram tracks used to be, allowing them to turn into a Fraser Street. These are all the ones that I'm aware of, so please let me know in the comments if you know of any others. There have been many ongoing calls for Geelong to once again run trams. As the second largest city in Victoria continues to grow both its population and employment, and the costs of cars continue to increase, many people and groups have lobbied for their return. If there ever was a serious attempt to bring them back, then the entire system would need to be built from scratch. Even if there are tracks left below the asphalted roads, these would be in such poor condition after decades underground that they would be useless when it comes to running rolling stock today. If you'd like more information on the extent of the network, I've made a map on my website here that I've linked in the description below. And on the same page, I also made a second map having an educated guess at where the stops were. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and check out my supporters portal over at members.philipmallis.com. And if you'd like to hear me talking more about Victoria's local history and transport, I'm on ABC Radio Melbourne with David Astle next at 8 PM this Wednesday the 2nd of July. So make sure you tune in to 774 AM on your radio or visit the ABC website. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.